Good day, everyone. We all up and we are live. Hopefully there are people joining us. I'm just going to hang on a second until it hits noon. But welcome, both of you. What's the weather like in New York?
Well, it is only 6 in the morning. It's a beautiful day, sunny already.
Oh, good. Don't go out like the people in England without their masks on the beach. That was insane yesterday.
That's happening here for sure.
Okay, I see many people have joined us. Welcome. Good afternoon to all of you who have joined us on the special webinar here on the interwebs. I'm Marianne Thamm, and my guests today were two young journalists with the independent newspaper, the Mail and Guardian, well, the Weekly Mail, not the Mail and Guardian, Weekly Mail, and who were thrust into a civil war, literally, in the East Rand and in KZN in the early 1980s. It was a time of massacres, it was a time of assassinations, it was a time of bombings, of the Bang Bang Club, and of warlords and death squads. So with me, on my right, but possibly your left, is Mondli Makhanya, veteran editor and journalist, and in May this year, he penned the longest sentence ever. A work of art, setting out Jacob Zuma's long walk to court. Mondli is currently the editor-in-chief of City Press, and you still have a bullet in your neck from those times, I take it. Mondli, is it still there?
I know when winter's coming, because the bullet tells me.
That's amazing. And of course, we have also our author, Philippa Garson, author of the just-published Undeniable, Memoir of a Covert War, published by Jacana. Philip is currently in the USA, as you heard us say earlier, a country that is still convulsing from its own racist past. So, Philippa, congratulations on a very harrowing but a deeply personal account. It's moving and it's heartbreaking, but it captures the time, also particularly for white lefties, if you would call yourselves that, of drug taking, the parties, and the jawling in the middle of all of this madness. But your book has given us time to pause a moment in history when we are able to perhaps reflect more deeply on those events in the 90s, because those ghosts are very alive and well, from FW being uninvited in the United States to talk, to the two inquests into Ahmed Timol and Neil Agate, and those happened in the 70s and 80s, to Jacob Dlamini's book, The Terrorist Album, and to Mo Sheikh's memoir. So it appears as if we're beginning to collect our memories after these waves, convulsive waves of violence for years and years and years. We've got to look back there. So Mondli, let's begin with you. What does that time mean for you, and how does it play itself out now?
So I must say, when Philippa sent me the manuscript initially, and because she wanted me to check some facts and also possibly do a shout out on the cover, and I read it, and I could not put it down, because it's a time that is there, it's etched in memory, but for her to have captured it so vividly in that book, and it took me back to those times. And there's a point that Philippa makes in the book about the fact that, we talk about the fact that we had a peaceful transition. And was it actually a peaceful transition? Is it a myth that you had a peaceful transition? Because those times were really blood-soaked. When you think about the late 80s, but in particular, the early 90s, after the unbannings of the political movements and the release of political prisoners, and it was a time we could have gone either way. We could have had a really, really, really full-blown civil war, which would have made us a Yugoslavia, which would have made us a Congo. We could have gone totally the wrong way. But we did go the right way. And so when you think back to those days, it is a time when violence, when death, when killing was very much normalized. And a time when suffering was something that people lived abnormal lives, and we thought that we were going through something, we were heading towards freedom, but we're actually going backwards. And And we used terms like black on black violence, we used terms like internecine violence, but it was actually a civil war of sorts. And we were all of us, I mean, whether we were journalists or normal citizens, we were all in the middle of it.
14,000 people, I think, is the body count from that short period of time.
Actually, kind of like is the more common one.
Yeah, Philippa, that time for you, and how does it play itself out now for you? I know you're in the United States, but even if that's personally.
Well, I think as I said, in my book that it took me. I mean, we all just moved on. You know, I mean, yes, it was this terrible time, this time of absolute civil war. But, you know, bang, democracy came. It came with new challenges. And I think everybody, you know, just kind of moved along. And it took me years to actually realize what had really gone down just in myself. And I started, all that stuff just came pouring out when I had the space away in New York. I had the distance to actually go back to that time and realize how brutal and how traumatic it all was. And, you know, so, yeah, we're 30 years later now, and I think you've made the point that it's a kind of generation and there's a time of reckoning. And I think I think there's a real sense of, as Mondli said, it could have been a total civil war. It could have gone so bad. It was bad, but we didn't go there. But I think a lot of compromises were made. And I think we sit with the legacy of those compromises.
That's what I'd like to get to that later, because I think you're quite correct in pointing out that that's what we're dealing with now. The title of your book asserts or suggests that there was involvement of the state and its third forces, and it's undeniable. Even though the TRC dealt with some of those massacres in those books, and when you go back again, Mondli, I don't know if you did as well, when you go back and read the kind of cruelty and mindless violence and the bloodbath of those train massacres, the Sebokeng boy, but you know, it was just endless carnage. But it seems that we were too traumatized at that time with these waves of continuous violence, and then dealing with the elections, and then dealing with, you know, trying to rebuild the South Africa, that we weren't able to process the meaning of that. So the fog of war kind of hung around. Now, when we go back to this, then what are we looking for? Are we looking for accountability? Mondli, what is your notion about what we do with that time? And who was accountable?
Look, I'm like, there's no question about it. I'm like, if you talk about who was accountable, it was the apartheid government, so the National Party government of the time, because they were fueling the violence, they were fueling the civil war, they were fueling the fact that the ANC and the IFP must be fighting, they were supporting one side of the conflict, and that namely the Inkatha, what is now the Inkatha Freedom Party, was with their surrogates. And then, as the book points out, I mean, like, there were other little gangs that the apartheid government also sponsored, like the Black Cats in Mpumalanga and so on. There were various surrogates of the apartheid government who were working to derail the process, to derail the path towards democracy. So definitely there must be accountability, and I think those who are still alive from that particular.
And we lost you there for a second, Mondli.
There must be some kind of confessions. Gata Buthelezi, who is 90-something now, and who still says he was a leader of the freedom struggle, he definitely has to account for a lot of the deaths that happened at the time. There was, but yeah, but
what Philippa explains in the book is how Inkatha goes from being a regional cultural power into a national power. It's hoping to insert itself in national politics with the help of the National Party and its various covert arms. So people mustn't forget that until the 90s there, and until the build-up to a multi-party democracy, that is what Inkatha was. And so part of that was a push to make it and to take the violence to the East Rand, particularly, which is where the book is set, and also KZN, those killing fields of KZN where you both found yourselves.
Yeah, exactly. And And the fact that the Inkatha Freedom Party became a national force and got a seat in the government of national unity was as a result of the fact that it fought for it through blood, not necessarily, yeah. But just to complete the thought, we're looking for accountability, but I think we are also looking for healing. I don't think we have healed. If you think back, immediately after democracy, we had a huge spike in crime between 95 and 96 and towards the late 90s. And a lot of that was those demobilized soldiers, to basically, if you can call them soldiers, but they were foot soldiers, they were on the ground. People who were demobilized and they had nothing to do. They had spent the past 5 to 10 years fighting. And now suddenly they have nothing to do. They're unemployed, they've got PTSD, they're traumatized. And what do? You do anything. I mean, like, the only language that you know is violence. And I think to this day, we're probably still suffering from the trauma of those times.
Philippa, your thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree. I think we know what happened. I mean, there was this onslaught, and the ANC responded. The guns were continuing to come into the country. MK was back. Everybody was young people were handed guns, and these people were 14, 15, 16 years old, and they were fighting. And I actually saw some of them when I came back to do research. These are much older men now. They are battle scarred. They are marginal. They are traumatized. I think the absolute effects of the brutality, the sights that people saw in Thokoza, with sort of bodies in the street, being eaten by dogs. I mean, how do you process that? How do you move on from that? And I think so many of these people were just sort of discarded. There was no space for them. They had committed acts of violence, and there was just no sort of rehabilitation. I mean, we all know what happened with, the crime gangs that sort of ended up sort of spinning off out of all of this. But I think the legacy is one of trauma. Absolutely.
Well, you also, in the book, give a sort of an account of Johannesburg at that time, where the both of you were working as journalists at the Weekly Mail, the house that you lived in. And I think, I was so moved by your ability to write about Tebogo, who came in, the street child who came to sleep on your stoop. I think many of us will remember. And those street children are still there, but albeit in a different form in South Africa at the moment. But the just lack of containment and care for the entire country, and mostly the black brutalized citizens, including people like Tebogo and these street kids who had to make a life. But your self-reflective stance of you don't want him in your house, but he can sleep on the stoop, and what can you do? So the helplessness of doing this job, which is, you're one of few women doing it all. So that was also part of the landscape. It wasn't just in these areas where the violence was. It was literally everywhere. I think bombs going off, the right wing going mad, the train attacks. If you go back to it in that moment, it is it's absolutely horrific. And the book reminds us. I think we're very numb as South Africans, or had to be, in terms of what that's done to us psychically.
I also think, though, that people, there was the negotiations were happening, and people just didn't want to know about the violence. I mean, there was this sort of numbness. It did just become a body count. People just sort of started to forget about it if you weren't in the middle of it. And I think that's the tragedy as well, that so many people just died these invisible deaths.
That's right. Mondli, you were part of, working with this white girl in this township. You came from KwaZulu-Natal yourself. You'd been an activist there, and I love the way sort of Philippa just begins to realize that she's absolutely this, this little, at the same time very feisty and courageous person. But actually, for you, it meant something completely different as a black journalist, finding yourself in the middle of that conflict, deathly conflict. If you didn't say the right words at the right time to the right people, you would be brutally murdered and set alight. I mean, the death could be awful. What are your thoughts about that partnership and what it meant to be a white journalist entering into a space in a different way, and your experience.
Yeah. So Philippa makes herself out to be this like little timid little white girl, wide-eyed, going into dangerous territory, but she was very courageous. I think. I mean, like she was my senior at the time, and like so she was no way.
I never said timid, Mondli.
But at a certain point, she holds you back at the very beginning of the book, where the two of you witness an attack,
Yeah.
and you feel as an activist still, and a young man in the middle of all of this, compelled to respond, and you have to decide in that moment as a journalist that you can't respond. You know, I mean, those must have been very scary for you.
Yeah, look, I must say, for me at that time, it was a weird sense, because I had come from KwaZulu-Natal, what was called Natal then, and I lived in from KwaMashu, which was at the center. I'd been a young comrade there, and we were fighting in Gata and fighting the system. And so I'd had to make a transition from being an on-the-ground activist to being a journalist. And I had to look at things. There's no such word, which all three of us are journalists, so there's no such word as objective. But I had to look at the world very differently. And so when we go out into the field, and you can see, I mean, like, it's not as if the comrades on the ground were angels either. I mean, like, the atrocities committed on all sides. That's what war was about. But I had to take myself out of my skin of being one of the other and against the other, and actually start to see things. But you know what? There were times, and Philippa quite very well describes it, and like, I actually had to think back and remember some of those moments where I had, I actually wanted to be part of the action at some point, because it was who I was. But I mean, I'm here for a different reason. I'm here to tell the story. I'm here to convey to the world what's happening on the ground through a journalist's eyes. And there was it was an emotional roller coaster seeing some of the violence that was taking place. Okay, being somebody from KwaZulu-Natal and being someone from that particular ethnic group and being a Zulu speaker, and a lot of those atrocities that were being committed by Ingata were being committed in the name of Zuluness. And I knew that it was. Are you allowed to swear on webinars?
Anything. Nobody's watching.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, lots are watching. Hello, all of you.
Ukrainian. It was bullshit. That it was basically what Ingata did manage to do very successfully was to mobilize the very strong force of Zulu nationalism to enhance its political place in the country. And when we would go to those massacres and seeing those atrocities being committed in the name of Zuluness, and it's something that it offended me gravely, because we had spent years and years and years in KZN fighting against that very thing. And so when people would say the Zulus are coming, and like you're always having to correct them, it's not the Zulus, it's Ingata. It's a political force, it's a political party that's doing this.
I think what's interesting about you having putting that out there is that's why Philippa, in a sense, the non-racial nature of what the ANC struggle was meant to be. But as a white journalist in a conflict situation like that, I mean, I went in earlier as a 21-year-old in the 1980s. There is a sort of protection or ridiculous white sense that you're standing out and you're there and you're not really part of what's happening, and you're this outsider. But you also, as you say, when you're with Mondli, you don't speak the language. You're not on the inside of that. Speak to the sense of what that was like for you, because you have your compatriot with you and your colleague with you, and you're his senior, and at one point you stop him from going to fight. But those emotions about the legitimacy of your being there and your capacity to report on it truthfully, in a way. You know what I mean? If I can ask that question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what I did try to make clear was how much of an outsider I was, and so how much of the nuance was actually lost on me. Then Mondli and I went in, and Mondli came out with the nuanced story about the battle. I just sort of saw all this stuff, but I think in a way, as an objective observer, you also, I say objective in inverted commas, but you also pick up all kinds of things that you might not. It's almost like a sort of naivety, and so you sort of see things, and you can perhaps communicate some of those things. But I mean, it was a very weird thing, because I think that moment can turn. I mean, I think that in a way, one's presence as an outsider, as a white person, was sometimes valued, because people wanted to say, look, we're being killed here, like, just observe us and tell the world. On the other hand, there was resentment. I think it was clear that one was just these were not your stakes. You were going to leave, you were going to go into the suburbs. And, I remember once in Alex just watching this terrible war, and, I write about it, and I sort of giggled at one point. We were all just like guns and bullets. And someone said, you're laughing and we're dying here, and that just brought home to me that, that terrible reality where, your presence is needed, but it's also such a sort of glaring sort of symbol of that exact thing, that these are stakes between people who actually had very little to lose, and here you were about to go back to a very different context.
But I think in a sense also what being white also enabled you to do was go into that hostel and have the meeting with that leader in our bumbling white way of, like, I'm just chatting to this guy, but the underlying sort of dynamics of power in that hostel when you're interviewing and it starts to get darker and darker, are fascinating outside. So part of your commitment to reporting also took you into places where other journalists might not have gone, black journalists might not have gone.
Well, actually, he was actually an ANC guy.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, some of those, especially the photographers, went into the hostels. I went into women's hostels. I never, ever set foot inside an Inkatha-controlled hostel. I remember being outside of one and seeing the bullets fly. I did interview an Inkatha hostel dweller, but that was, spirited away from the actual hostel in the safe offices of a union, union building. So I do reflect on the fact that we were reporting on one side. It was very hard to get access to that side, and people looked at us with suspicion, because I think they knew we were not supportive of this imported violence into the reef, and they were getting the backing of the cops, and they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want us to know about that.
Let's speak a bit about the constant reports from people of white men in balaclavas, and how you have to, it's easy now to go back and sort of work out who they were. And that's what I found interesting about your book, is that there's more complexity to these men that keep getting seen in the township, arriving the night before or on the trains. Linking back, but Mondli, your own reporting there as well was part of the mission, not only to report on the violence and the devastation, but to try and catch red-handed in an undeniable fashion the hand of these covert killing units. Training in Inkatha was that part of the mission?
Yes, definitely. I think we were all in search of what became known as the third force. Because we all knew that fine, Inkatha, it's got its regiment, it's got its warriors going into battle. But there were always these white men in the middle of it all. And whether you call them mercenaries or whatever, but there was always people there. We knew that the hostels were being supplied with automatic weapons by the security forces. We knew that there were people who would be in the middle of the fighting. who were there, who had been planted there, and it's just like highly trained white men and white soldiers. So, and the book does actually, like there's a very vivid incident of one of them actually being left behind, and it's we knew it happened, and I think that's one thing that has still not been properly unraveled. And the Goldstone Commission went some distance towards it, but it has still not happened. Who were these people? Who were there? Who were these elite forces who were not just fueling it, but very much at the forefront of the killings?
Philippa, perhaps you want to pick up on that as well, because I think it's important for us to know this.
I became completely obsessed about the guy that I write about, that, Mondli and I saw, the blood on the ground and this cap. And I got obsessed. I got in touch with Madeleine Foulard, the missing persons expert. And, we trawled through the mortuary books and who was that guy, There were so many witness accounts, in fact, of two guys. There were just no traces, just nothing to be found. And, it was just, it was that thing of the kind of, where's the evidence? I think Greg Marinovich said in his book, we were all looking for the third force, but we knew who they were. I mean, they were the security forces basically, but they were, these are people who are trained in special force activity. I mean, these are people who leave no traces. And, I mean, I do think there was an element of, perhaps the sort of, it started to become a kind of repeated thing of they were white. Maybe they weren't always. Maybe it did sometimes become the stuff of legend, but I know they were there. We all know they were there. At one point, I interviewed that riot cop, in Zulu, and who said we paint our faces black, when we go in it. So we just know these stories didn't come from nowhere, and I think it's for me one of the biggest frustrations that we were never able to actually unmask it.
Well, I mean, that's also partly why I think you're seeing the re-emergence of this discussion at the moment, particularly with F.W. de Klerk being disinvited. And then you have the Timor inquest where the NPA says they don't want to charge the two of the policemen because of their age and that they didn't testify at the original inquest. But then you have evidence that was presented at various commissions, including the Truth Commission, and where also, the State Security Council, where people like Baron du Plessis was, signed off and said, verwyder or get rid of Goniwe. So we're finding pieces in the puzzle that lead back to leadership, but there will always be plausible deniability. And that's the frustration, is that one is gaslit because 44 tons of evidence was burnt and destroyed. But so your title, in a sense, nails onto the doors of South Africa's history undeniable proof that the previous government was involved in that violence. I mean, is that your position?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I mean, of course, we don't know, exactly who, but we know that the top people in the security forces knew what Eugene de Kock was doing. We know that Eugene de Kock was just one of them. I mean, he said whatever they were doing the heavy lifting at Vlakplaas, But I mean, there were other units like Vlakplaas all over the place. And
well, there was Wouter Besson's chemical weapons unit throwing bodies out of planes,
Exactly, and we know that the military, the Directorate of Covert Collections, had a massive budget and a massive operation going. And when Goldstone did that swoop, the so-called raid, and took one file, and the rest of the stuff disappeared. I mean, what is that stuff? I mean, it's just a vast mountain of covert activity that we need.
And disappeared people, Mondli, yes.
Yeah, just like coming, and I think it's one of the things that we do not talk about enough in this country is about the extent of the evil of the apartheid state. particularly in the latter years. It was truly, truly diabolical. And I mean, you speak about that voter person period. I mean, like people being thrown off planes and that the injection of poison into beers and so on, and the booby trap bombs, and we all remember that. And then we come to the period of 90 to 94, that the period of that violence, the extreme violence in Gauteng and KZN. You know, there's nothing that equals the horror of being a train passenger, and you are all crowded into this coach, and men come into the train with AK-47s, one at the other end of the coach, and one at the other end of the coach, and they just spray the coach full of bullets, and then jump off at the next station and disappear into nothingness. I'm like, that is what the apartheid state was doing, while on the other hand negotiating at Kempton Park with the other political parties around the constitution. And so coming to the present and hearing Helen Zille making the kind of comments that she was making the other day about comparison between apartheid and the today. I mean, like, and yet there was an evil government and an evil system in place which kept joked about human life. And
it was amoral. It was utterly amoral and savage.
Immoral, yeah.
Immoral and amoral. But I think, we spoke earlier on about that's why, in a sense, Jacob Dlamini writes in Ascari as well, the system was so diabolical that it would co-opt people it was busy oppressing in some way, turning you to fight against, it was through money or through coercion. The extent of the evil is the right word. And what Jacob Dlamini said last night in an interview, we might have spoken of this in the green room earlier, is that if we had to charge people involved, they would be poor black men. But that doesn't take away the leadership and the people, I think, who still can be held to account regardless of how old they are. But there seems to be a pushback. I mean, the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice, who've been, I think, lobbying for the NPA and for the president and for the government to actually pick up the 300 investigations that were forwarded from the TRC to the NPA. And there appears to be a dragging of heels, and there appears to be an accusation from the coalition that there's some sort of deal that was struck behind the scenes because of the inability to really take, for instance, the Goniwe, matter, and those matters have been referred to. There have been investigations, but no prosecutions. So that's why Zille can tweet something, because we've forgotten when you read Philippa's book and you read Jacob's book and you read Moshake's book, one has actually forgotten about the diabolical nature of apartheid. I don't know how we got there. Perhaps because no one was held to account. Is that your feeling, perhaps?
Is this Philippa?
Either of you. Yeah. Philippa, if you, yeah.
Well, I'd like to ask Mondli actually what he thinks, because, I mean, why this is the question that no one seems able to answer. I mean, yes, we know there was a compromise, and we know that deals were struck, but why has there been this inability or this absolute lack of will to bring this stuff up? Why is this stuff being sat on? And I want to know, Mondli, what do you think?
Well, the theory that, the overwhelming theory that's there, and I think it is a theory, is that there was a deal struck that you don't prosecute us and we will keep your secrets. We know who were the spies. We know who who spied for the apartheid government within the ANC and so on. But, and it makes sense to a certain extent, but for me, it doesn't go far enough, because I think we've gone through a transition from the exile government of the ANC to a lot of people who were inside the country. So not everybody would have been part of that particular deal, whether it's midnight deal was struck in 1993 or early 94, whatever it was. I think for me, it's more about, we had the Mandela years, and Mandela was a lot about, let's keep things quiet, let's just move on. Let's have a truth commission, let's have the truth told and people confess, and let's not go the Nuremberg route, let's not rock the boat, and everybody will live happily ever after. And I think we had those 5 years, and we probably wasted those 5 years. If anything was to have been done, it should have been done immediately after the Truth Commission. Those people should have been gone after, but I don't think there was appetite from the main government to do that. And I think they just thought that South Africa would transition and there would be economic growth, people would have jobs, and somehow the country would develop and people would not feel the pain going forward. Massive mistake, because those evil people are still in our midst and the pain is still there. People are still paining from that particular period. There's still a lot of suffering, and we as a country have not healed. And we see the damage that those years did, that apartheid did to this country in social
destroyed life.
This particular one.
And this one,
I wanted to before I take. Sorry, Philippa.
No, I was just going to say. I mean, was it just so brutal? Was it because it was so brutal that there's just been this amnesia about it? Like it's as if it didn't happen. And that to me is the ultimate betrayal to all those people and the families, those people who just died in the exact kinds of ways that Mondli described, on trains, whatever, in shebeens. So, yes, the culprits were not brought to book, and, it was like, okay, this is a different ship, we've got to govern, we've just averted war. Maybe there wasn't the appetite, but it just seems to me also quite weird that even in the sort of narratives of the struggle and, the thing to democracy, the great miracle, that this whole period has just not been really examined and brought into part of the history.
Very much so. And the problem with that is that it becomes...
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think that it becomes part of the DNA of our psyche, that we hold on to it, in a sense. Before I take some questions from our 350 people who have joined us, I just wanted to talk a little bit quickly about Chris Hani, who you got to meet and who you got to interview. Both of you, your impressions of the damage that was done by the elimination of Chris Hani for whatever reason at the time. I mean, that took us to that precipice, which in a sense resulted in Mandela going on national television before he was the president, and in a sense becoming the de facto president of South Africa by saying, do not, this cannot go up in flames. So if you could just both give your reminiscences about Chris Hani, his murder, and perhaps, what purpose he could have served, if any, and then we'll go to some questions. Mondli, if you want to begin.
Yeah, look, I mean, it was, it's one of those things that, as tragic an event as it was, it actually spurred us forward. It's sad to say so, but had he not been shot on that particular day, and the ugly scenes that we saw, the escalation of violence, and that took us, as you say, took us to the precipice. That actually sped up the process towards 1994. Yes, we would have loved to have seen a Chris Hani come into democracy and become a strong leader alongside Nelson Mandela and all the others post 1994. And it would have been great also to have seen him travel the 1994 to 1999 period, that period of transition, take the people with him, because Chris Hani had that extra touch that Nelson Mandela didn't have. He could talk to people and explain to them that this is what we are doing. This is why we are going the direction we are going. And perhaps he would have also put a break on some of the extra reconciliatory moves of Nelson Mandela, who, as much as he did amazingly in the first 5 years in terms of healing, of moving towards healing the nation, he didn't heal the nation, per se. But I think we could have dealt with a lot more of the deeper issues had you had a figure like Chris Hani around. I'm not sure if I would have wanted him to be the president of South Africa, though, after. But I think he would have been a very, very key figure in transitioning us towards becoming a more normalized society.
Mondli,
Philippa, your memories? Sorry.
Ask Mondli, do you think he would have nationalized the economy a bit too much, or what? You didn't want him to be president?
Yeah, no. You know what? I mean, like, there are things we wish, if only someone had survived, if only somebody had been around, I think he would have taken us a bit to another level. I think the person who took over from Nelson Mandela was the correct person to take over from Nelson Mandela.
Okay. I mean, I might beg to differ, but because I do think that Chris Hani really, really cared about poor people. He really did. And I mean, I just think, look, I don't know, we could debate this, but I just think that Chris Hani I think he did stand in the way of a lot of people who had other agendas, some of those nefarious agendas that we talk about as to why things have just not, why there's been this shutdown. I mean, if it is one of the reasons that, that deals were struck. So I think it's quite tragic. I mean, you always, you sort of immortalize someone. We don't know what he would have been like. I mean, he died young. He wasn't leading a country and having to be accountable. But I think it was a very sad day for the country when he died.
There is a country called Venezuela somewhere in South America.
Mondli. We can have this conversation. But what I really loved in the book is that you do meet Chris Hani and you interview him. And so, again, just to remind people, where he stood at that point and how crucial he was in convincing people that, in fact, this violence needs to stop one way or another, I'm just going to go to some questions from our webinar participants. Nyameko asks, what does going back mean to the deals agreed to during CODESA? That's one of the questions. I don't know if either of you wants to. And also during the season of state capture, do we have the wherewithal? So that's a good question.
You take that one, Mondli.
I'm not sure I fully understood it.
Well, essentially, sort of, what do we do about what we know? And I think possibly what Nyameko's meaning is that we find ourselves still somehow dealing with the collateral damage of that time. How do we go back? Is there a way of going back? And if we go back, I mean, whether it's prosecutions, Nyameko asks, does it mean that we can renegotiate the deals agreed to at CODESA? Yeah. And also, if you look at where we are in terms of state capture and the resources required to unravel that other chapter of trauma in South African society, do we have the wherewithal?
You know what, when we talk about the CODESA deal, I mean, like, people talk about the betrayal of 1994 and so on. There is nothing that we did wrong in 1994. We negotiated a perfect constitution. I mean, like, no constitution is perfect. I mean, like, every constitution has flaws, which is why you have the ability to amend and re-amend and so on. But the 1994 deal was the deal that we got. And the deal gave the democratic forces political power. ANC came into power in 1994, and with political power, the ANC was able to do a lot of things. We got a lot of progressive legislation through as the democratic state, and there is nothing within the democratic infrastructure of South Africa that prevents whoever is in power from fulfilling the dreams and aspirations of the people. The only thing that's missing is political will to implement what is there. I mean, the fact that the democratic government could take on industries such as mining and force them into a massive legislation, force the oil companies into BEE legislation, And I mean, like, there are things that are there that the government hasn't passed, but the ANC government was interested in other things, and they have just not been willing to exercise the power that it has in its hands. So this notion that there was some kind of 1994 sellout or a 1994 compromise, it was not a compromise. The National Party actually saw it in 1996 when it pulled out of the Government of National Unity, that we have been defeated. Yeah. So all that's needed, that has been needed from the ANC, was to actually do that. There's nothing to renegotiate. What we need to do is implement as a society, not particularly, I'm not talking as somebody who's, I'm not talking about the ANC. I'm talking about this society of ours, but the ANC is obviously in power. They can implement a lot of things if they were willing to do so. So I don't think we need to go back and do anything. In terms of prosecutions, yes, let's prosecute. I think there are people who actually have to be prosecuted. I'd love to see a lot of those apartheid generals, those National Party politicians, and Gaja Buthelezi in the dock. So I think we need to do that. Whoever it is, Germany is still doing it now. But then I think, in addition to that, and fast forwarding, in addition to that, I think we have to do the state capture prosecutions also very expeditiously. Let's not wait another 20 years before we start talking about prosecuting people from the state capture period. But what will hurt state capture prosecutions is the fact that we have not begun to prosecute those other crimes from that particular period. It delegitimizes that particular prosecution process of the present, which actually has to happen.
Yes. I mean, what's quite interesting is that we have former President Jacob Zuma, at various appearances at the Zondo Commission, referring back exactly to that time around spies, so that unhealthy fog and toxic fog that existed back then still surfaces all the time in terms of who is culpable, who's not culpable, who should be outed, who shouldn't be outed. Philippa, your any comments on what Mondli has just said, which I think is very true, that everything is there. We need to implement and we need to do it. There's nothing stopping us.
I think it's very true. I mean, I do think that Mondli's right that, things happened in the way that they should. There was really no other way to bring about democracy. But I do look at the world today, and not just South Africa, but South Africa being a shining example of inequality, of the wealthiest alongside the poorest of the poor. And I just feel that it doesn't work. I mean, look at America, look what's happening. We've got the Jeff Bezoses. We've just got, this tiny group of people getting richer and richer and richer, and this vast swathes of people getting poorer and poorer. And I believe there's got to be a third way. We've got to find that in the world. There's got to be a sort of compromise. So, I do believe that South Africa needs to look at those challenges, and it perhaps goes a bit further. I'm not talking about a Venezuela. We know that doesn't work, but I think that these questions have to be dealt with. I think the system, the way it is not really delivering to poor people, to young people. I mean, you hear the youth talk today, they feel left out, they feel marginalized, they feel like there's no future. So, that's the one thing. And I think on the other point, it's totally true. I think because we didn't really pull those people into the dock in the way they should have been, we have these obfuscations that Zoom has been doing, and it can continue to do. Where it's all going to be murky, you can just play the murky game,
But it's the same with the apartheid generals and the ministers and FW, where you can actually go into the world and say apartheid wasn't a crime against humanity. Show me the evidence. There's that ongoing idea of evidence. But I think also just South Africa found our way to freedom. As global political currents were changing as well, and so we got sucked with the rest of the world into what became a post 9/11 world, become a post 2008 world. So we're always on the back foot because we seem to be embroiled in horrendous, torrents and currents, political currents, which we actually couldn't afford to do when the West and the communist bloc began to stop fighting with each other and something else happened. So we got caught up in all of that. And I think I'm very heartened by what both of you have said, that actually this was the best we could do. But it's still, when you read your book, the cost
The cost, tremendous
The cost. The cost. I think we are so traumatized, even now during COVID. South Africans have been, when I go to Europe and I meet people there and talk to them about politics, particularly Europe, the United States is different. People feel like babies without skins and shells, even though they're a genocidal continent and they killed 55 million people in the Second World War, and they hold on to that in Germany. We just feel like we are in ongoing non-stop trauma. And a question related to that in a way, because it's from Ashok, who says, given the socioeconomic challenges today in South Africa, is South Africa stronger and better able to deal with these, including the imbalances? I mean, difficult question in the middle of COVID, if either of you want to answer.
You go first.
So sorry, the question was, because of what we went through, is the country...
Yeah. Well, given, and are we stronger and better able to deal with economic challenges today? I don't know. It's difficult in the middle of COVID to have any idea.
No, I don't know. And as you say, Marianne, I mean, South Africa's buffeted about by, huge global forces that are very difficult to be immune from. So no, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I do think South Africans have an incredible resilience. They've been through such a lot. They have also a kind of, I think, in terms of, for example, the race stuff that's happening here in America, I feel that even though South Africa probably hasn't begun to deal as well, it's tried to, and it tries to in an ongoing way deal with all this sort of, the stuff that's been sort of thrown at it. I just feel there's a kind of sophistication in South Africa about seeing things as they are, in a way. I mean, that's not helpful in terms of sort of economic solutions, but I just feel that the people see things, they don't just hide. There's something about in America where you've seen all these protests, and it's almost like this, it's just been allowed to fester, it just festers in this way. It's just, look, it's also a majority different situation, but I just think South Africa is such a brave country and actually confronts what is in front of it, and even the way that COVID is being dealt with, to me is heartening. I mean, we can criticize some of the things, but it just, brave is the word that comes to mind.
If you look at our BRICS partners and how they've dealt with COVID, we're the only ones who come out looking good. Sorry, Mondli. Yeah.
No, just on that, I think Philippa's correct. I mean, I think we took some really tough decisions at the beginning. In 1996, what was derided as what was called gear at the time, and it was derided as neoliberal and so on. It was a very brave decision that was taken by the Mandela government with Trevor Manuel, Thabo Mbeki, and that lot in power at that particular point. We could have easily become bankrupt, but we took a very tough decision. And so I think we are strong, but there is the question, the reality of the wasted decade. What happened during the Zuma years weakened us a lot. And we need to rebuild our institutions. We need to rebuild our institutional strength. And I think a lot has happened in the past 2-3 years in terms of starting to rebuild those institutions. SARS is one particular example of that. The NPA is another example. And I think we are beginning to do that. But unfortunately, it's going to take a long time to get back to where we were beginning to get to before Jacob Zuma came into power. The stats that came out this week about unemployment being nearly 31%. And this is in the first quarter of this year before COVID hit. So when the second quarter stats come out, it's going to be even more horrific. And given the legacy that we've spoken about during this conversation about our violent past, you can only imagine what that is going to breed. So I think what is needed right now is the political will. The institutions are still in place. The institutions can be repaired. They're not totally destroyed. They were damaged by Jacob Zuma. We need to move very fast in doing so. And we need a leadership that is going to be willing to do that. And that is what everyone is crying out for Cyril Ramaphosa to do right now. And if he would just get off his butt for 5 minutes and start to actually do the thing that he was elected to do, there's an urgency that is required at this point.
Can I ask, Marianne, Mondli, so what should Cyril be doing like right now?
Cyril should be doing what Tito Mboweni is doing. Tito Mboweni, like the biggest challenge in South Africa right now is economic. You need to take very tough decisions. He needs to face down his rivals, RET rivals in the ANC. He needs to face down the Communist Party and the trade unions and take very tough decisions that are going to give us a lot of pain for the next 2 years, but build a foundation for going forward. If you think about the decisions that were taken in 1996 around gear, they were very unpopular, but they got us out of a debt trap. And around about the beginning of the 2000s, the government had a surplus that it was beginning to spend. We're doing a lot of socio-economic spending at that particular point, and we could have continued doing. By now, if Jacob Zuma had not come into power, we would be in a very different space. So we need to go back and take those very tough decisions. There are some very clear economic blueprints that the finance minister speaks about, and the mainstream of economists, everybody accepts that this needs to be done. The National Development Plan, which the ANC adopted in 2012 at their conference, the government adopted, Parliament adopted, that needs to be implemented very aggressively. And that's what needs to be done. There's no rocket science to it.
But I think that's absolutely true. And I think what this conversation has done and what your book has reopened, and we haven't got much time left, but I just wanted to say, the violence that we have always lived with in South Africa is something we all have to own. And I think a lot of white South Africans who were spared what you write about in your book, Philippa, need to read it to understand the trauma that has been wreaked on and the destruction of the Black family, of Black life, on levels that, how do people who survived that, or the children of people who lost parents, then they're still with us. We're the walking wounded. And there's something that needs to be held around that deep pain so that we can move forward. But it's there. The gender-based violence too, yes.
If I may just come in there, I think you've hit it on the head there. I think the white South Africans, I think there's a big responsibility there to understand, first of all, exactly what happened in the past, what apartheid was about to begin with, and what happened during the period that Philippa writes about in her book. They're somehow insulated from all of that, and they continue to be insulated from the situation from the country that they live in. And I think they need to understand their past and understand their present. I think it would be a huge step towards our healing and socio-economic development.
That white South Africans should accept it's part of their political DNA, that in one way or another, they were complicit. Philippa, I think we're running out of time. I just wanted to tell everyone that if you sign up as a Maverick Insider, you can get a copy of the book. I've got all these things, and at 25% off, people will find it. I just wanted to thank you very much for writing that book. It wasn't an easy read, but it was an important and necessary read, and I'm going to go back and read it again. Those times are so vividly recreated. Mondli, thank you very much for continuing to write very long sentences and for rattling us in any other ways. Philippa, is there anything you want to say in parting in terms of, do you miss us or are you happy there?
God. No, I totally miss you. In fact, I've got this feeling of anxiety that I cannot, just because of COVID, can't get on a plane. My family's there. My heart is actually there. But, I've got a foot in each continent. What can I say?
Well, thank you very much for going back to that painful place. reminding us of it. And I'd like to thank all the other authors who are doing the same thing at the moment. And, those South Africans who need to, we're going to have to face something very big in the next few years around COVID, and we have to do this together, and we can. So thank you very much for putting another little stone in the mosaic, and thank you, Mondli, for everything you do.
Thank you.
And both of you, take care. People get the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.